Welcome back. This is part 2 of the chapter 4, a video lecture on verbal messages, and really this is on speech and linguistics. So we're going to talk about characteristics of a language, and for some people, I've noticed that this is an area where people tend to struggle when you actually start thinking about what makes languages languages. We're going to really focus on 3 characteristics of language: that it's arbitrary, it's abstract, and it changes over time. But there are actually 7 characteristics of language, and I found this little slide that I thought was a good way of listing them. And I found it after I made the PowerPoint and uploaded it. I didn't want to change the PowerPoint. So language is arbitrary. Language is social. That means that it is something we use to communicate with each other. It is symbolic. That means that there are letters that represent sounds or words that represent meanings. These are symbols for certain things. It is systematic, meaning that there are rules to it, that there are certain things stand for other things, that you have rules for grammar, you have conventions. It is vocal, meaning it is uttered through voice. It is not instinctive. We learn language. We learn it through conventions, we learn it through usage in our societies, and it is productive and creative, meaning it is something that produces meaning and helps to create meaning or your reality. So those are the 7 characteristics of language, and on your quiz you can actually use any of them. I'm not just limiting you to these 3, but these are the 3 that the book talks about and that we're going to focus the most on. So it's arbitrary, meaning that words do not, we'll actually talk more about each of these in the next slide. So it's arbitrary, it's abstract, and it changes over time. So arbitrary, it means that the symbols and words lack literal connection to the things they represent. The word house doesn't look like a house. Neither do some French words, chez, maison, or villa, or villa if we're doing the Latin version. Hut doesn't look like a hut, cottage doesn't look like a cottage, hovel doesn't look like a hovel, mansion doesn't look like a mansion, castle or palace. But those all are words that we use to represent those concepts. And you can imagine that what each of those means, except maybe chez and maison. Speakers agree collectively that certain sounds and letter combinations equal words, equal concepts. So we have collectively agreed that the place that we live is called a house. The logic for why a house is called a house is really very little more than because we said so. We as a group just decided that that's what it meant through convention. Really through convention, it was through other languages, and over time, like for instance, a window comes from the word wind door. Well, we originally, we made up the words for wind and we made up the word for door. We don't really know where they come from, but we agreed that that's what those words meant. Wind is that thing that blows, and a door is how you get in and out of a house. And then we agreed that a window was a wind door, that wind used to get in and out of the house, and that's why we call it a window. There's not really any more logic to it than that. Language is also abstract. It represents concepts, but it cannot itself be concrete. You cannot put a piece of language on a platter and hand it to someone. Even if you write words on a sheet of paper and hand those to someone, there's not a concrete representation of language. It can only represent objects and ideas. Language cannot become those ideas. And different words or different terms can mean different things to different people because it can't be concrete. So if I said imagine a house, you might see a very different house than I do. I'm going to see this big kind of purplish blue house that I grew up with railroad tracks on the front of it and a kind of big yard. You might imagine something very different, maybe the house you grew up in or the house you're in right now. Because it's abstract, the word house can mean different things to different people. Language also changes over time. And we have this weird idea that there is a single correct form of English, and that's actually not true. There's a standard form that we have collectively agreed is the form used in academic settings and professional settings, but there are many different forms of English, even outside of the speech communities we were talking about. And part of what happens, I'm sorry, I don't know what's with my voice right now, is that old words become obsolete or they disappear. We add new words. I talked about adulting. Adulting is a good word that we've added. Google. We use the word Google as a verb. That's a new word that's been added. And meanings of words are altered as we use them. So some words change. The word to walk. For instance, before 1400, that word meant to toss and turn, particularly with waves or with thoughts. But it didn't refer to putting one foot in front of the other. Now it means to ambulate by putting one foot in front of the other. And, well, taking a walk meant to mull over one's thoughts, and it's always been commonplace. Over the time, we changed it from the process of thinking to the process of moving. That's an example of a word that has changed meaning over time. Some words disappear entirely. The word crepuscule, it means twilight. The word's really not in use because it really doesn't evoke any sense of twilight. It really sounds more like a disease than it does a boil or something. So it's really only used in scientific circles for patterns of waking and sleeping. So you might hear cats are crepuscular. That means that they tend to be most active at twilight. They're not the only animal, but there are a lot of animals that are like that. And that's really the only time we use this word anymore, because it wasn't a word that people tended to use very much, and so it just disappeared and fell out of usage. But before we get into these three schools of thought, I actually wanted to show you one other thing I found online over here, which is characteristics of specifically spoken language. We were talking about characteristics of a language as a whole. Now we're going to talk a little bit about when we speak out loud versus in writing, because they are different. You probably don't want to speak the way you write an essay in an English class. I've tried. People find it really off-putting, and they tend to get in arguments just because it sounds weird. We have very different rules for writing in an academic setting versus, say, speaking with your friends. And some characteristics of spoken languages are the use of personal pronouns. So we tend to use a lot more pronouns than we do the nouns they represent, like I and you, he, she, it, all of those, because those create a sense of relationship between speaker and audience. You know, like you and I, we're in this together. It's us against the world. We also tend to use second person, you and your, we is first person, but those type of things a lot more to create that sense of community and identity in spoken language than we do in written language, where, like, for instance, in academic writing, the word you is banned. Many teachers would quite literally rather you use profanity than the word you, in written language. But in this speech class, I'm going to prefer you to use you, because it's going to be very strange if you sit there and go, the audience here, and you should be listening, that's going to create distance between you and the audience, which is the exact opposite of what you want in a speech. Spoken language also uses shorter sentences, so we tend to use smaller units of information that are easier to follow than larger ones. You're not tending to have a whole lot of semicolons and be Faulkner-esque with one-page sentences in spoken language. It tends to be a lot more short declarative sentences and commands and imperative sentences. We also tend to use a lot more of colloquial words and contractions in spoken. Colloquial meaning kind of local familiar terms, slang, idioms, figures of speech, that kind of thing. We tend to use vocabulary that is more familiar, so it tends to be a little bit lower diction, and you're less likely to use a whole lot of polysyllabic words in spoken language. Ideas, words, and phrases are repeated. So in written language, you might have been told by English teachers not to repeat yourself. There's time and a place for it, but In spoken language, it's actually better to do a little bit more repeating to reinforce ideas and to help the audience to remember them, because they're not going to have a chance to go back and reread what you've said because you're saying it. So we tend to repeat things more when we're speaking. We also, because it's impromptu and we're just doing it off the cuff often, we can't be as choosy with our words because we can't really go back and revise them in the same way that we can with writing. Good speeches, good spoken language uses transitions, signaling, and summary statements. So it helps guide the audience through the process. Again, this often has to do with repeated words. It often has to do with transitional elements and signposts. And unlike with written language, where there's a person speaking with spoken language, so there's more variety in the tone of voice and inflection. There's body language. If you could see me right now, I'm gesturing all over the place. You can probably hear the gestures in my voice. That's another characteristic of spoken language that differs from written language. So I wanted to talk just briefly about that. Well, that actually gets us to about the time limit here. So now that we've talked a little bit about some characteristics of language and of spoken language, I'm going to stop this PowerPoint. I'm going to stop this video lecture, and I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about these language and meaning, 3 schools of thought, and going to go into a little bit more detail about how people approach speech and how people approach language. So I will be right back in just a moment.